There's always going to be some kind of maintenance that you're going to have to do on your mountain bike. Some tasks can be a little bit complicated, but there's actually quite a bit that you can do on your own. Changing your brake pads on your mountain bike is totally something you can do, and I'm going to show you how to do it in this video. Hello my friends, welcome to another edition of Regular Guy Mountain Biking. My name's Gene Arnold, and in this video I'm going to show you just how easy it is to change the brake pads on your mountain bike. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to need to do is, of course, get yourself a new set of brake pads. Brake pads are not compatible with every single brake system, so that means you have to make sure you get the right type of brake pads for the brake system that you have on your bike. Another thing to know is that brake pads do come in different compounds. Okay, you can get them in more of a resin-based compound and in a metallic-based compound. So not only do you have to get the right brake pads to fit in your brake system, you want to make sure you get the right compound to complement the system that you're running. If you're not sure which pads to buy, the safest bet is to take the bike to a bike shop. Let them know what you're doing. They'll help you understand which brake system you have and what pads you need to replace the ones that you have on the bike. Next step, you're going to need to remove the wheels from your bike. It's not technically required to do both the front and the rear brakes at the same time. I kind of let this bike go a little bit, so I am going to be doing both the front and the rear. But regardless, you do need to take the wheel off the bike with whatever pads you're going to replace. So if you're replacing the rear brake pads, then you need to take the rear wheel off. Likewise for the front. Again, these pads are pretty worn down in this bike, so I'm taking off both the front and rear wheel because I'll be replacing all the pads on this mountain bike. As your brake pads wear, the pistons that push them against the rotor push out little by little. Okay, so as your brake pads wear, the pistons will continue to push out just a little bit to take up the space of where your brake pads have worn down. Now do me a favor and remember this for the end of the video, because I'll be talking to you about when you may need to bleed your brake system, and it kind of connects to what I just said a second ago. So don't forget this topic. Now before you can install the new brake pads in your system, you're going to need to push the pistons back into the calipers. You can do this with something as simple as a screwdriver. Just push the screwdriver between the two old brake pads and gently twist it little by little, working both brake pads back into the caliper, or basically pushing the pistons back in the caliper using the old brake pads. Now you never ever want to do this against the actual pistons themselves. Okay, you'll scratch them, you can break them. Don't do that. That's why we're using the old brake pads, to protect your pistons. So again, use the screwdriver, and little by little, when you twist it, you can gradually push the pistons back into the calipers. Now the reason why this step is so important is because if you don't do this, when you put the new brake pads in the caliper, there won't be enough room to fit the rotor in between them, okay? Because remember, your brake pads wore down a little bit, and that's why the pistons pushed out. Now, when you put new brake pads on with a lot of meat on them, they're going to be too close to each other because the pistons are still out, and you won't be able to get your wheel back on the bike. So you have to push the pistons back into the calipers, and that's why you have to take your wheel off the bike in order to do this step and push the pistons again back into the calipers. Now it's time to remove the old brake pads from the calipers. This is a very, very easy step. The first thing you'll need to do is pull off the safety clip that's attached to the pin. These clips are used to make sure that if the pin ever comes loose, it can't fully back out and fall out of the caliper, because if it does, your brake pads could possibly pop out. Okay, so the pin that this clip is attached to is the same pin that's holding the brake pads in the caliper. So kind of important, but very easy step. Just pop the safety clip off the pin. With the safety clip removed, you can now unscrew the pin and pull it out of the caliper. Very simple, just to unscrew it a little bit and it slides right out of the caliper. And finally, you can remove the old brake pads from the caliper now. You simply just pull them right out of the top. They should pop right out. Really should be a piece of cake. Your new brake pads should be pretty much ready to install right out of the box. Now, just in case something might have moved in shipping, let me show you exactly how to set up the brake pads for installation. The two brake pads will have a metal spring that fits in between them. The reason for this spring is it's designed to push the brake pads apart and push them against the pistons. If this spring wasn't there, as your brake pads wear and you let off the brakes, they would rattle in between the pistons and the rotor. Okay, so without the spring, you'd have a rattle in there, which is not what you want. So that's what this spring is for, to keep the brake pads firm against the pistons and stop them from rattling. With the spring installed in between the two brake pads, you simply just squeeze the brake pads together a little bit and slide them right back into the caliper, exactly where the old brake pads were. Now, some brake systems don't use metal springs to push the brake pads against the pistons. Some systems actually have magnets inside of the pistons, and the magnets hold the brake pads uptight against the pistons. Basically, the concept is identical. Either it's a magnet or a spring, regardless, both are doing the same thing. They're taking the brake pads and holding them against the pistons, so as you ride, you don't hear rattling of the brake pads inside of your calipers. Now, simply reinstall the pin by sliding it right back through the caliper and through the brake pads. Okay, tighten that up, and of course, don't forget to install that safety pin on the end of the pin. And with that piston installed, now it's time to reinstall the wheel back on your bike. Now, this next step is optional, but it is one that I like to do. I like to loosen up the brake calipers just a little bit so that they can move freely. Then I take a business card, I rip it in half, and I slide it in between the brake pad and the rotor. So if you think of it like a sandwich, it's going to be brake pad, business card, rotor, business card, brake pad, okay? The idea here is you're using the business card as a small spacer in between the brake pads and the rotor. Now, with the caliper, again, just able to move a little bit freely, I then go and squeeze the brake lever for this caliper, right? Since the caliper can move a little bit, it will basically center itself, but it will center itself also around the two halves of the business card. The business card is going to give it just enough space in between the rotor and the brake pads. Okay, so when you squeeze that, the pistons are going to come out, they're going to find out where they need to be, and the caliper will realign itself and everything will be cool. Now, don't be surprised if you have to squeeze that brake a couple times to reset the fluid. Okay, so if you squeeze it and the lever goes all the way in, don't be nervous. That's pretty normal. Okay, we'll talk again about bleeding the brakes towards the end of the video. But squeeze it a couple times, all of a sudden you'll feel the lever get stiff again. And once you have that, hold that lever in tight. The caliper will now be centered, and just go and tighten the bolts just real quick so that you can make sure that the caliper doesn't move anymore. We'll tighten them properly in a moment, but just make sure you tighten them enough so that when you let go of everything, the caliper won't move. So now that you got your hands free, okay, and you let go of the brake lever, I do like to use a torque wrench to properly set up the brakes. I mean, they are your brakes. You want to make sure you get it right. You know, I joke about torque and I go, oh, it's tight enough. But when it comes to the brakes, you want to make sure they're correct. Each brake system actually has its own torque spec, so just look that up online. And it's also important to do this properly as you move more and more into carbon fiber bikes. You don't want to mess around with the torque not being correct, okay? So anyway, when I tighten these back up, I do like to use a torque wrench. Now, I want to talk real quickly about what it means to bleed your brake lines, when you might have to bleed your brake lines, and what it means to have air in your brake lines. You can tell when you have air in your brake lines when you squeeze your brake lever and it still feels kind of squishy. Remember when I said before, when you squeeze it a few times, it should get firm again and you should have a good braking power? Well, if that lever still keeps coming down to the bars, or it just feels kind of rubbery, there's a good chance you have air in your lines. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that as your brake pads wear down, your pistons, right, move out further and further from your calipers. When this happens, something has to take up that space when the pistons move in, okay? What takes up that space is more fluid, and that fluid comes from a small reservoir that you have up in the brake levers. Now these reservoirs, they're little. It's not like you have a ton of fluid up there. So as your brake pads really wear down and the pistons go pretty far out, at some point you might not actually have enough fluid to compensate for that space. And unfortunately, there's a good chance that air can now get injected into the system because you let your brake pads wear down too low. Now when this happens, there's really kind of no way to get around it. You're going to have to bleed your brake lines. It's not the end of the world, and after you do it a couple times, it actually becomes pretty easy. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to cover that in this video, but that might be another good video for me to make on how to bleed your brake lines. But if that's something that you feel uncomfortable with, then definitely take the bike to the bike shop and have them bleed the brake lines for you. You don't want to screw this up. They are your brakes. But like I said, it's not really the end of the world. And if it happens, it happens, okay? The lever is a little squishy and you have to fix it, but it's really not that big a deal. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope you found it helpful and you feel confident to change the brake pads on your own bike. If you did enjoy the video, please think about giving it a thumbs up. And of course, I'd always love to have you as a subscriber to the Regular Guy Mountain Biking YouTube channel. Post any questions that you have down in the comments below. As always, keep the party on the pedals, my friends, and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a good one. Bye-bye.